Hi, sophomores. From scores on quizzes over the last couple of days, I feel like some of you need a little bit more practice on meter identification. So this is one more video to help you review for this part of the test tomorrow. So we're going to start just by looking at the very beginning of it, which is what meter consists of. And you got to remember, there's two words that go into meter. And this was a problem a lot of people had on those quizzes, was they just put one of the words instead of putting both of them together. Shakespeare didn't just write in iambic, he wrote in iambic pentameter. Both of those are important. So the type of foot, this is where we have those four main types of feet. We have iambic, trochaic, anapestic, and dactylic. And if you need to review what those look like, and this would be a good thing to, go back over before the test tomorrow. Anapestic is unstress, stress. Trochaic is stress, unstress. Anapestic is unstress, unstress, stress. And dactylic is stress, unstress, unstress. Then when it comes to the number of feet, this is where we have all of the numbers up to 9. Manometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, octameter, nonameter. There were a few people who got mixed up on the number roots, and instead of going with tetrameter, went with quatrameter. So make sure that you keep the number roots straight. There's two versions for some of those numbers, and this is what they need to be for poetry. So to answer a question about meter, you have to have both of these parts. You can do iambic, dimeter, anapestic, nonameter, dactylic, heptameter. You can kind of match them from each column, but you shouldn't just put one of them. You have to put both. Otherwise, you're only getting half credit, and that's just no good. So in order to kind of go back to the basics of how you figure out where stress is, I want to use some of your names because sometimes it makes a big deal to people whether their name is pronounced correctly. And your pronunciation of a name is based on, what sounds the letters make, but then also where the stress is in the name. So there's a way of pronouncing a name, if you put the stresses in the wrong places, that clearly sounds wrong. And there's a way that clearly sounds right. For at least this first name, it's pretty clear. Jacob Becker. Jacob Becker is pretty clearly trochaic dimeter. We can test this. Remember, one of our ways to kind of test it out is to try doing something a different way and see what it would sound like. So let's try to flip those around. Let's try to make it iambic instead. This would sound like Jacob Becker. Jacob Becker. I hope that doesn't sound right to you. If it does, then I've been saying this name wrong all year. Jacob Becker. Okay, now let's go to a name with more syllables. Christopher Wolf. This should be Christopher Wolf. So he would be either, remember, if you have an extra syllable, then you have a couple different options for how you name it. If you just go with this, with these first three, that kind of a foot is dactylic. So that would be dactylic manometer. That leaves one syllable out. If you counted just these three, that also leaves one syllable out. That would be anapestic manometer. Again, we could try to do it differently and see what that would sound like. Let's try to do Christopher's name with a different rhythm. We'll do Christopher Wolf. Christopher Wolf. That gives us a nice even pattern. But as I hope you can hear, that first name is pronounced incorrectly. Christopher, not Christopher. Okay, next name is not one that you would run into in a line of poetry. It might be just one little piece of a line of poetry, but not the whole line. And that's because This is where we get the Sponday. Good job, Mark Schroll. Both of those names get full stress because there's just the one syllable to them. Mark Schroll. Sponday is 2 stresses in a row. Okay, and then I put Casey's name on here. Casey is not hard to figure out where the stress goes. I never thought like, oh, maybe it's KC. But at the beginning of the year, I usually go through names with Mr. Cormier before the first day to make sure I know how to pronounce everybody's name. And my guess as to the pronunciation of Casey's last name was Bilal. And Mr. Cormier informed me that that was not correct, that his name should be pronounced Bilal. And I still kind of think about that every time if I'm going to say Casey's name. I kind of overthink where the stress needs to go, and I'm never really sure that I'm saying it right. So maybe if Casey watches this video, he can tell me for sure where the stress is supposed to go. Okay, so now let's go to a situation where it's a name where it is a little bit more difficult to pronounce. So our teacher at Mount Michael, our engineering or architecture teacher, is Mrs. Sedlacek. And that's, I think, the most common way of pronouncing this last name, if it's spelled that way. However, we have had, and we're about to graduate, a senior, Trenton. His last name is not pronounced Sedlacek. His family pronounces their last name Sedlacek. So that's one of those things that kind of, again, people feel very strongly about having their names pronounced correctly. And the pronunciation there is not, I'm not like changing the way that a vowel is pronounced or something. All I'm doing is changing the place where the stress is in the name. All right, one more example. With some nice Italian names. One of these was a senior last year. The other was a senior. I shouldn't say was a senior. He graduated in, 2014 or something. I don't know. The years all blend together. But anyhow, these two guys pronounced their first names differently. The first one is the way that I assumed the second one's name was pronounced, but I was incorrect. This first one is Stefano Brunelli. However, this student, instead of Stefano, his name was Stefano. And then we have Tarantolo. So really, it's those first names that I wanted to point out to you. Again, the vowel sounds are being pronounced the same way. The consonant sounds are being pronounced the same way. The difference between Stefano and Stefano is the stress in the name. And so I hope that kind of helps you think about how you're identifying the stressed and unstressed syllables when we get into a line of poetry. In the context of a line of poetry, it might not seem quite as black and white as it does with how you pronounce a person's name. But you are going to need to be able to at least listen to the way that I am pronouncing the line and mark it to match with the way that I am pronouncing the line. So with doing some very basic practice, we're going to start the same place we started with examples in our notes, which is with nursery rhymes. So what I'm going to ask you to do here so that I don't have to read all of these a million times in a row, I'm going to read it through once, and then if you would like to hear it again, you can rewind the video and, listen again and try to mark the syllables. For the test, I will read through each line 3 times. But for right now, I am not going to. You can just pause it and rewind. So here we go. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. All right, so here's what these lines should look like. Mary is 2 syllables, Mary. And if we say this whole line together, Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So if we were giving names to these different lines, the first one we would have two options. We could either call that trochaic trimeter, in which case there would be one extra stressed syllable at the end, or we could call that iambic trimeter, in which case there would have been one extra stressed syllable at the beginning. The second line is more straightforward. It is 3 iambs, iambic trimeter. Next line, still iambic, but this time it's going to be tetrameter. There's 4 of them. And then in the last line, we're back to iambic trimeter. All right, let's go on to another one. Another nursery rhyme. Keep it simple. If you want to fast forward to something more complicated, feel free. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. All right, so this one goes twinkle, and think about what it would be like if you marked it backwards. It would be twinkle. That's just not how we say the word. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. And in identifying these lines, on all of these, they start and end with a stress. So these are going to be like the first line of Mary the Little Lamb, where you have two options: trochaic trimeter or iambic trimeter. And again, to explain how that works, it's all depending on how we're what parts of the line we're identifying. So if we do trochaic trimeter, that means we're looking at this 1, 2, 3 feet. And there's an extra syllable on the end. If we were calling it iambic, it would be because we're looking at it like this, leaving one stressed syllable out at the very beginning. Now we go to a guy that is still kind of nursery rhyme-ish, but the rhythm is a little bit more, I don't know, slightly more complicated. So here's this one. Mark along if you'd like to practice. And the children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And their ma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap. Okay, here's how this one goes. And the children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And their ma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just said, I just marked it over the wrong place in the word. Had just settled down for a long winter's nap. Okay, so this has two lines that are kind of perfectly laid out in terms of meter, and two that are kind of weird. The ones that I'm going to ask you to come up with a name for on the test are only going to be ones that fit it pretty perfectly, not ones that have different types of feet in the same line. So both both lines 1 and 3, those two lines are the same thing. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 feet. And if you were to check back on your list, those are anapests. That would be anapestic tetrameter. Now, since I've told you that there are different ways of identifying some of those, like I showed you that on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, where you could call this either trochaic trimeter or iambic trimeter, it's not always the case that there's two answers. It was the case here because you have an extra syllable with either of those labels. That's not the case for these lines. Because if I were going to say, like, okay, well, let's look at that first line. Instead of calling that anapestic trimeter, I want to start marking, I want to start identifying syllables here. And say, look, that's dactylic trimeter. Okay, sure, there are 3 dactyls there, but you left out 3 syllables from your pattern, and you want to account for as many syllables as possible. That's just the name of the game. You'll notice that in these other 2 lines, the second line and the fourth line, both of those have 3 anapests, so like anapestic trimeter, and those both have an iamb at the beginning. So you will not have any like that on your test. However, if you mark a line and you feel like, okay, well, that's what I came up with and maybe it's wrong, but that's all I can figure out, you could call that iambic manometer plus anapestic trimeter. That way, even though you might have the stress, or you might have the stresses marked wrong, you still are identifying it correctly. Let me actually do a better example of that with something that would be marked entirely wrong. Let's pretend I'm wanting to hear that first line in iambic. Here's what this first line would sound like if it was read with an iambic rhythm. And, oops, and I'll use not yellow so you can actually see it. And the sorry. It's hard to pronounce it wrong. And the children were nestled all snug in their beds. I hope you can hear that it does not sound right compared to, and the children were nestled all snug in their beds. If you were reading it normally, it would sound a lot more like this one on top than this one on the bottom. But let's say you marked it in iambic and you're like, well, I don't know. That's all I can come up with. That's all it sounds like to me. If you told me for the test, if you gave me, well, I marked it in iambic and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to call it iambic hexameter. I would give you credit for that. So I guess if you want to if you're really bad at identifying rhythm and you want to just write down random syllables that you know you can give them the right label, you'll at least get half credit. Although it's probably better to aim for full credit by trying to get the stresses right. For our next example, we're going to go on to something a little bit more interesting. This is from the Beatles, from Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So I'm going to read it aloud again, and you can mark it if you want, and pause it and listen to it again if you want, but I'll show you what it should look like after. Picture yourself on a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. The girl with kaleidoscope eyes. I really love this one as an example for meter because when you listen to the song, they're very deliberately, I don't know that the Beatles really sat down and said, like, we want to use a dactylic rhythm. I'm sure they actually didn't, but when you're listening to the song, the rhythm is, I mean, it's unusual, but it's very, very clear in the way they're pronouncing it. So this one should look like this. Picture yourself on a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. The girl with kaleidoscope eyes. So none of these lines really have one clear name that we can give it all the way through, but we can still take a stab at identifying them. That first line, we've got 3 dactyls and a spare trochee at the end. The second line, we alternate, you could say. So I have no idea how you would name this line. It's quite complicated, but it's iambic and then anapestic and then iambic and then anapestic. Then line 3 is exactly the same as line 1. A lot of times you'll see poets or songwriters do that. They kind of alternate the rhythm in lines. And then this last line, there's an iamb and then 2 anapests. So that one we can name a little bit more easily. Iambic manometer plus anapestic dimeter. Okay, we'll do one more. I hope this one sounds familiar to you. I hope. When shall we 3 meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done? When the battle's lost and won? If you remember, the witches' lines from Macbeth are quite sing-songy, and they rhyme all the way through, unlike the lines of most characters in most scenes of the play. So this one looks like this. When shall we 3 meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done? When the battle's lost and won? So the first, third, and fourth lines are all the same. And those I would call dactylic trimeter. That leaves 1 extra syllable at the end. Or you could call it iambic trimeter, which would leave 1 extra syllable at the beginning. There's only one possibility for that second line, though. That second line would have to be iambic tetrameter. Okay? All right, I think that's going to wrap it up here for practice. If you're watching this, it's going to be on Wednesday evening, but I guess still email me if you have questions. I can do a brief review before the test tomorrow, but please remember, you do need to be on Zoom for the test on Thursday at your normal class time. Okay, thanks guys.